So what I want to do this morning, yesterday at the final presentation by Hagang, we talked about, he introduced some really rich data on issues connected to energy and the environment in China. Today, that's what we're going to plunge into much more deeply. Again, I'm going to set a context with some generalities, and then we've got three extraordinary panelists who have been right on the front lines dealing with environmental issues in China for a very, very long time. And so we'll hear from them their experience as well as their thoughts on a lot of these issues. Now, I'm going to build on some of the things that I talked about yesterday when we talked about China's quest for wealth and power. And this quest for wealth and power, as was mentioned in a number of the presentations, after the reforms began at the end of 1978, but really picked up steam from the early 1990s, China has been in this headlong rush to develop the economy. But this has involved a trade-off, and that's the title of our seminar, between rapid development and the consequences for the environment. And I think it's important to recognize, and I'll go into this in a bit more detail later, that the consequences of the environment have been both internal and external. It's not just an internal domestic Chinese issue, but it has global implications. It's also important to realize that China is not unique in engaging or facing this trade-off between rapid development and concerned consequences for the environment. To echo what Tom Finger said yesterday about looking at China, 1.3 billion, you can multiply 1.3 billion, you can divide by 1.3 billion, and it gives you a really great way about thinking about the scale of issues that China confronts. So in terms of this trade-off, China's not unique, but the scale of China has much greater implications for the entire world than for the other countries which have gone through this process. The Industrial Revolution in the West, industrialization by the communist states in Eastern Europe, by the four tigers of East Asia, all have had examples of this trade-off of rapid economic development without thinking initially about the consequences for the environment, because they find the need to develop is so pressing that they'll deal with environmental issues later. Now, as Tom Finger said yesterday, China needs to change its development model for a number of different reasons. That also it's important to recognize that the development implies an ongoing process. There's no real end point. Development, modernization implies that there's always somewhere new that you have to keep advancing towards, some new goals. And China, partly by virtue of its success and partly by virtue of the fact that this is the experience of so many other countries, faces a number of competitors. The Chinese don't like to talk about a Chinese model, but the Chinese adapted a lot of the experience of Japan, Taiwan, and South Korea and Singapore in terms of their development model, though of course on a much greater scale. And as with those other countries, China is facing a number of competitors who say, we could try this too. And so that the low wage model, the lax labor regulation model, aspect of the model, lax environmental controls, strong tax incentives to stimulate attract foreign investment as well as stimulate economic development. These are the sort of things that China has learned from so many other countries, and now other countries are copying China. So China has to think about how to change its development model as a result of this competition. So the Chinese, as I say, like so many of these other places, used lax environmental regulations and implementation of the rules that are on the books as one incentive to attract foreign investment. This has been referred to by some analysts as a race to the bottom. Who has the most lax environmental regulations, or who will not enforce regulations that are on the books as a way of attracting foreign investment and making the situation worse. But then the question arises that is there some crisis, or is there some critical point, some tipping point where the state will decide we've done this long enough. We've succeeded at this, but now we have to face up to the environmental consequences that have been brought about. And we need to reform our policy in the direction of sustainability. We can't keep doing what we've been doing. The consequences are too great. Now we must invest in cleaning up the mess that has resulted and implement the rules that may be on the books. But the state also faces a problem that if we do that, if we actually implement these, pass and then implement these regulations, we risk scaring away foreign investors. That if so much of economic development is now relying on foreign investment, and then we start enforcing these rules, people aren't going to invest anymore. So this again raises a lot of these issues about this trade-off. How can we clean up the environment and get foreigners to still come, but to be responsible citizens and to invest, to buy into the idea of sustainable development? So what happened in the East Asian states, Japan, Taiwan, and South Korea, who had fouled up their environments terribly, is they made huge investments in environmental cleanup, commitment to sustainable development, and implementation of laws and regulations. The first time that I went to Japan, first time I went to Asia was 1969. And in Tokyo, the air was so vile that at intersections, large intersections, they had oxygen dispensing machines, where while you were waiting for the traffic light to change, you could put coins in a machine and breathe oxygen while you were waiting. Now we think of Japan's environment as being, I wouldn't say pristine, but beginning in the 1970s, the Japanese government reached this stage of saying we're killing ourselves. There were some very big stories in Japan about the consequences of environmental degradation. The Japanese government, also implementing a state-led development model, said, we've made a huge amount of money, we've had a lot of success, we're killing ourselves. Now we have to invest in cleaning up. And they did it. They cleaned up the environment, they made a major investment. Subsequently, Taiwan and South Korea have done the same thing. So now, will China invest in cleaning up the environment, committing itself to sustainable development and implementing the laws that are on the books? China has acknowledged that it has a severe environmental crisis. It has committed itself to cleaning up the environment and engaging in a new track of sustainable development. And it's interesting that China is very different from India in this. India and China, we often think of, they often compare comparative examples of huge countries engaging in rapid economic development. And there was a front page article in the New York Times a couple of months ago about, I've never been to India, but India's environmental crisis. And the Indians have not acknowledged the severe environmental issues that they're facing, whereas the Chinese have, and I think this is very much to their credit. But again, saying we have a crisis, passing regulations to deal with the crisis, but actually implementing them are very different things. So now to back up a bit after setting the stage, we talked yesterday something about the Chinese traditional view of nature. And many of us think when we think of China's traditional view of nature, we think of Taoism, we think of Buddhism, and Buddhism, the idea of doing no harm and accumulating karma so that you'll be reborn as something better in your next life, and yin and yang, that we have to achieve balance in nature, balance in society. And these sort of traditional landscape paintings are an example of the way that we often think, or the Chinese present their attitude towards the environment. Now, I looked at this picture recently, and there is somewhere in there a tiny little person. I can't see it. Can anybody find it? There's a tiny little person, I think sort of in the right, on the right side. But this is, can you see it way tiny? But yeah, there's the guy, yeah. But this is an example we think of human beings dwarfed by nature. That humanity needs to find harmony with nature, that nature is so much greater than humanity. So many people think of Asia, China, Japan, and so on as always wanting to be in harmony with nature. But that's one aspect of Chinese traditional attitude towards nature. But the other aspect is controlling nature. As I talked yesterday when we about the diversity, China has a number of really critical challenges that it has faced traditionally in terms of dealing with nature. So one of the Chinese culture heroes is Yu. Da Yu means great Yu. And he's a culture hero because he controlled the floods. So this is an example of controlling nature, trying to figure out a way of controlling nature. For those of you who have been to Chengdu, the capital of Sichuan province, you probably have gone into the suburbs and visited this place called Dujiangyan. This is an irrigation water diversion structure that was built, I think, in the 3rd century BC. I forgot to I didn't get a chance to do my homework on that. So you may look at it and say, yeah, what's the big deal with that? Well, this was an introduction of flood control by a Chinese official 3 centuries, I think it was the 3rd century BC. And this is another place that the Chinese, to this day, this still operates to deal with flood issues. And it's something that the Chinese hold up as an example of how they have successfully controlled nature. Now, in volume 3 of the selected works of Mao Zedong, there's a very famous essay called The Foolish Old Man Who Moved the Mountain. And what Mao does, this was written during World War II, when the communists at the end of the Long March were holed up in northwest China in a place called Yan'an. There's a number of different ways of Romanizing this place. Yan'an, it is an extremely poor, extremely underdeveloped, extremely dry. It's very quintessential North China. Very, very dry, very arid, tremendous problems with lack of water, very difficult terrain, loess soil. The soil is very fertile, but it blows around. It's very loose and it blows around. And this is where the communists ended up in World War II. And during this period, the Communist Party, the peasants, the soldiers, and people who migrated there because they'd heard about what the communists were doing during the Japanese occupation, turned this place into a highly successful model of economic development. They talked about turning the desert green, basically, is creating a South China kind of environment in North China. And how did they do it? They did it partly through hard work, but partly through voluntarism, through the power of the will, is that they studied what the problems were. They united around identifying problems and finding ways to solve these problems, and they conquered nature. And in his essay, written during this period, called The Foolish Old Man Who Moved the Mountain, Mao Zedong says that there's a Chinese myth, famous Chinese story of this foolish old man who said that this mountain was blocking access of his family to a village, to another village. And that he wanted to find a way to have a better way to get to that village, and the easiest, the most practical thing to do, or most reasonable thing to do, was to remove the mountain. And everybody laughed at him and said, "You'll never be able to do that. You just can go around it." He said, "I'm going to start it with my sons, and we're going to start removing that mountain. And if we don't finish, their sons," of course very gendered, "their sons will continue, and they will remove the mountain, and will continue until we've moved the mountain." So this embodies this idea that people may tell you something can't be done, but if you have the right attitude and you unite with other people and you work hard enough, you can conquer anything. So the Chinese communist attitude towards nature, which derives from this myth as well as from Da Yu and from Dujiangyan, is that another example of the way that humans can conquer nature. You should not let nature conquer you. So when I Googled Foolish Old Man Who Moved the Mountain, there's a number of pictorial representations. This is the beefcake model. It didn't transpose very well. It's a little blurry. But there are others that are more traditional Chinese painting style. But this one was a little more amusing, I thought. So that's why I picked it. And after the communists took power, one of the things that they did was to implement the foolish old man psychology, and especially in North China, was building all sorts of irrigation systems in order to bring water to the parched areas of North China, literally removing mountains, that nothing could stand in their way. And during the Cultural Revolution, there was a model village called Dajai, which is in North China, not terribly far from Yan'an. And that was held as an example of a place where they literally moved mountains and removed mountains in order to bring water and to cultivate crops in an area that people had said was not suitable for agriculture. But Mao proved you could do it. There's a backstory to that, but nonetheless. So here's an example of Chairman Mao in North China at a place where you could see that there's a water diversion project. So current examples of this attitude of conquering nature is the Three Gorges Dam. We talked about that in in the session I was at yesterday. Three Gorges is an example. And so one of the things the communists have said, if people have said that it was impossible to build a dam across the Yangtze River, but we're going to do it anyway. So many so-called domestic and foreign experts said it can't be done. But the communist leadership, beginning 20-some years ago, many of whom were hydraulic engineers, their mentality was, we can conquer nature. We can build this thing. And they built it. And I don't know if any of you have been through the Three Gorges Dam and been through. It's a really impressive piece of work, an engineering marvel. Now, what the consequences of that might be for the environment, still up to question. And there have been a number of earthquakes in the area, and some people feel that it's cause of the huge amount of weight of the water that is backed up in back of that dam. Now, I talked yesterday about the problem of North China, not enough water, South China, too much water. One of the things that the communists have now engaged in is a south-north water diversion project. They're building canals from the Yangtze River north to the Huai River to divert water from the south, not just to get rid of it, send it to the ocean, but to bring it to the parched areas of North China. So again, it's this attitude of nature it's just another problem that we can solve. Oh, 3 minutes. So there's my fellow panelists will talk about a lot of other issues related to environmental problems. But let me just tick off a bunch of things here. And Hegang yesterday, I forgot to mention that his name Gang means iron or means steel. This is very appropriate for somebody thinking about industrialization and environment and energy. But domestic, the airpocalypse. And he showed us some of those, some of the charts of the air crisis in Beijing. Water issues, water pollution, water scarcity, and flooding. Soil issues with the application of not only of chemical fertilizers and pesticides, but also runoff from industry. You have terrible problems with heavy metal pollution in the soil, which then gets absorbed into many of the crops, which are used for human consumption and animal consumption. This leads to a problem of food safety. There have been issues with milk powder, with all sorts of fake goods. And it was a year or so ago, there was this issue of farmers dumping all of these dead pigs into the Huangpu River, which then floated down by Shanghai. Problems of waste disposal. And one issue related to waste disposal is the Chinese have an industry, and they're not alone in this, of importing all sorts of waste from abroad and then recycling and processing it and reusing a lot of the things that they're bringing in. This includes a number of electronic goods. And 60 Minutes, for those of you looking for something to show in your classes, there's a 60-minute segment which was done a few years ago about a village in Guangdong, not too far from Hong Kong. And they traced electronic goods which were collected in Boulder, Colorado, which is a very eco-friendly place. And these goods were shipped to China. They traced the whole thing, shipped to China, and you see peasants sitting with soldering irons and flames, dismantling a lot of these electronic goods and inhaling the flames, and then the waste put in the water and all of that kind of stuff. So workers, citizens are exposed to all this various kinds of pollution. Now the Chinese talk a lot about sovereignty, how important, don't interfere in our internal affairs. But at the same time, these domestic environmental issues are not just domestic in nature, they have external implications. The air, the polluted air from China drifts all around the world. Korea, Japan have to deal with air pollution from China, but we do in California as well. Our West Coast gets some of this air pollution from China. Chinese exports, many of them are carrying all sorts of chemicals and various kinds of pollutants. There have been issues of exported toothpaste, pet food, and toys from China, which carry all sorts of toxins. Ocean pollution is a serious problem, as not only pollution of the oceans, but also overfishing. China is engaged in a global search for energy and natural resources through legal and illegal means. So whereas they may sign contracts for minerals or for forest products or for other things, at the same time there's an illegal operation which is going on, probably not state sanctioned, but the state knows about it in many countries, especially in Southeast Asia and Africa. The Chinese government and Chinese private investors are buying up farmland, mines, and forests all around the world. Someone mentioned Africa yesterday, but also in Latin America, the Chinese are developing large soybean farms, especially in places like Brazil, to supplement their own production of soybeans, and also buying up forests in many parts of Southeast Asia and elsewhere. They're building infrastructure in neighboring countries, in particular places like Myanmar and Laos and Thailand, to source raw materials and energy. They're building pipelines, highways, high-speed rails. Part of it is to help Southwest China gain access to not only to markets, but also to the Indian Ocean, the Andaman Sea, Bay of Bengal, and so on and so forth. The Chinese, as the middle class rises, the middle class consumption, Chinese are consuming all sorts of endangered species for a variety of different reasons. So a lot of the issues related to ivory and other endangered species are as a result of increased Chinese consumption patterns. So finally, just to bring this back to some of the issues that I raised yesterday, this is a question of state-society relations, the nature of the Communist Party, the political system, things that Rosie talked about as well. The middle class is not only increasing its consumption, they want all sorts of consumer goods which have implications for the environment, but more and more middle class people now are concerned with quality of life issues. Part of the Chinese dream, it's not only material prosperity, but it's a better quality of life. And so Chinese and the middle class and others are concerned with a lot of these environmental issues, as is the state. But one of the questions is, will the state, the Communist Party-led state, open a space for citizen participation, citizen involvement in identifying environmental problems and proposing solutions for them, and then working together with the state and other stakeholders, which Rosie mentioned yesterday, in order to address these. And this, of course, will be the burden of much of what Kristen's going to talk about. But just to tick through these things, this is not a secret. Nothing that I've talked to you about is a state secret. This, as I said, the Chinese government has been very upfront now about publicizing, they can't hide it, a lot of these environmental issues. There's been a lot of domestic media coverage. The Communist Party, the Prime Minister earlier this year officially declared a war on pollution. The Communist Party has called for building an ecological civilization, which whatever that means, I think sustainable development. There are a large number of citizen protests, which are increasingly covered by the domestic and foreign media, against polluting plants, destruction of the environment, corrupt deals which pollute the soil, water, and air in the countryside, and shoddy construction, what's referred to as doufu or tofu, bean curd construction. So the 2008 terrible earthquake where there were schools that collapsed, office buildings that collapsed, homes that collapsed, this revealed a whole side of corruption in terms of how these buildings were built and the number of hundreds of children who were killed in the collapse of schools. The earthquake that occurred the day before yesterday, I'm wondering if this is also going to open up a whole set of stories about corruption involved in construction of buildings. Also, many of the people who in these areas are ethnic minorities, and which brings another whole area. So what we see, and this is a segue into Kristen's speech, is the emergence of non-governmental organizations within China, as well as abroad, which are working with the Chinese state and with Chinese and non-governmental organizations to address a lot of these environmental issues. So Kristen is going to talk about her organization, which is called Pacific Environment, and hopefully she has some literature and can share how to get involved with them. But another one that I wanted to mention, it's virtual. It's a website called ChinaDialogue.net, which is a bilingual Chinese-English website. So for those of you who are thinking of things you want to do projects in your classrooms where students can find out the latest information on environmental issues, you go to that website, and I just went to it this morning. You can subscribe and get regular briefings, but I looked at it this morning, great deal of information on all of the topics that we're interested in.